king of German mercenaries.
Chapter 323, Eastern European Slave Girl. It was estimated that it would take several months to build the theater, and it would also take a long time to invite experienced actors from Italy. Therefore, Marin ordered the recruitment of handsome men and beautiful women with good voices and strong desire to perform among young men and women in the country, while continuing to revise the script. Previously, in Marin's script, there was a plot where the goddess of wisdom persuaded the main god. Marin thought about it and it seemed that there was no goddess of wisdom in Christianity. Moreover, in Christianity, only the Virgin Mary can be said to be a universally accepted female god. Moreover, even for the Virgin Mary, there are factions that do not recognize her status as a god. In later times, when religious influence declined, it was okay to make mistakes, but in this era, Marin could not make mistakes. In fact, Marin had previously written the goddess of wisdom into the script, completely confusing Christian culture with Greek culture. After discovering this mistake, Marin quickly corrected it, cancelled this plot, and changed it to directly have God send Einstein to redeem Marin. Moreover, in order to avoid suspicion, Marin kept the story unchanged, but used other names for the characters. For example, the protagonist's name was not Marin himself, but Matthew, the same name as Matthew, one of the 12 apostles who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. Then, Mrs. Mary was replaced by Mrs. Maria, Old Hoffman was replaced by Old Hoffman, Adler was replaced by Adler. In short, Marin didn't say it was about himself, but anyone who has seen the play will understand, this is about Marin. While revising the script, Marin also had to carefully deal with Angela who had returned to prevent her from discovering the affair between him and Felice. But Felice was not a pushover, always pestering Marin and asking for sex. However, Marin obviously had no chance at night because he had to sleep with Angela. In desperation, in order to deal with Felice, Marin moved his lunch break from the front yard of the palace to a remote corner on the left side of the junction of the front and backyards of the palace. Then, he also moved Felice's residence to the left side of the backyard of the palace, with a special passage leading to Marin's lunch break. So, every noon, when Marin was taking a nap, Felice would always sneak into the nap room and have sex with Marin. Both Marin and Felice felt extremely excited. However, Marin's body couldn't handle it. Fortunately, the honeymoon period with Angela was over, and Marin didn't have to do that with Angela every night. Otherwise, Marin's thin body couldn't handle doing that every noon and night. Felice was having sex for the first time, but she liked this feeling very much. She was wild and very active. Marin was made to lose his temper by her, so he just lay down during the nap and let Felice move on top of him. Then, Kohler secretly sent people to the cattle slaughterhouse to look for more bullwhips. During this period, Marin ate kidney noodles early in the morning and bullwhip soup made by Batel for him at noon, which barely protected his body from being deficient. At noon that day, Kohler personally brought the bullwhip soup cooked by Batel to Marin. It was obvious that he had something to say to Marin. "Kohler, why are you the one who brought the soup? Is there something?" Marin saw Kohler personally carrying the bullwhip soup and knew at a glance that Kohler had something to say. After all, Kohler was a baronet and a big shot in East Frisia, so he didn't need to do the work of servants. "I knew I couldn't hide it from you, young master. You are so wise." Kohler flattered him with a smile. As a result, after finishing the bullwhip soup in one bite, Marin wiped his mouth and said, "Stop talking nonsense, master. I have to go to the front to work now. If you have anything to say, please speak quickly. It's like this. The boat that went to Venice to buy soda for Romani and the others is back." "What? Is there something wrong?" Marin asked curiously. If it was a normal situation, such a small matter would not alarm him at all. "Nothing has gone wrong. It's just that the person in charge of purchasing on the ship told me some news. I think it's good, so I came to report it to you, master." "What kind of news? Is it important?" "Well, I can't say it's too important, but maybe it's very important. Anyway, it's hard to say." "Then tell me about it." "Yes, sir. It's like this. Art, the buyer in charge of buying soda, met a merchant in Venice and sold him a very special product. Guess what it is, sir? Guess your uncle, tell me now. If you don't, I'll beat you up." Marin said unhappily. Master, let me tell you, that Venetian merchant took the trade route from the eastern Mediterranean to the Black Sea, and had trade relations with the Crimean Khanate in the southeast." "Stop talking nonsense and get to the point." "Yes. The Crimean Khanate is a bandit state. Every year, they go to the steppes of Eastern Europe to plunder the local population and sell them as slaves. Every year, the number of people sold is as high as several thousand or even tens of thousands. Marin soon remembered the Crimean Khanate, a strange country. In later generations, the Crimean issue had become a very famous hot spot, attracting the attention of the world. So, at that time, Marin also looked up the relevant history of Crimea, and was stunned by what the country had done. You know, the Crimean Khanate had a small population of only a few 100,000 people. But they sold more than 2 million Eastern Europeans to all parts of the world in the 200 years from the 15th to the 18th century. The main sales destination was Ottoman Turkey. Western Europe also bought a small number of their slaves. The city of Kaffa, now Feodosia, on the Crimean Peninsula was the largest export port for the Crimean Khanate slave trade. There were also many merchants from Venice and Genoa in the port of Kaffa. Therefore, Marin was not surprised that Venetian merchants had channels to sell Eastern European slaves captured by the Crimean Khanate. I know this. Marin thought of Kohler's introduction. He knew much more about this history than Kohler. You know this too. Kohler was a little stunned. When he first found out about it, he thought it was a strange story, but he didn't expect Marin to know it all. Well, isn't it just that the Crimean Khanate captured Eastern Europeans and sold them as slaves? What's so strange about that? Marin said nonchalantly. Well, master, you are awesome. Stop flattering me and get to the point. Yes, sir. I heard from that Venetian merchant that it is very easy to buy female slaves from Kaffa. Slave girl? What do you want a slave girl for? Marin looked skeptical. You know, Kohler is also a baronet, with a distinguished status. What kind of woman can't he find? Kohler wants to buy a slave girl. Does he have a special fetish? Marin suddenly became interested. It's not me who wants to, sir. I'm thinking about my brothers in the army. Brothers in the army? You mean, buying female slaves as rewards for single soldiers? Yes, master is wise, that's exactly what I mean. Maumei. Marin held his chin and fell into deep thought. There is no doubt that the mixed blood Maumei is very beautiful. Whether it is Russia or Ukraine, they are places where beautiful women are abundant. Buying some Maumei beauties as rewards for bachelor soldiers as wives can also boost morale. Most of these young men who joined the army in Marin were poor and bachelors who could not find wives. If there was a glimmer of hope, who would be willing to do such a dangerous job as a mercenary with their heads tied to their belts? There is no way, the German region is too poor. The fertility of the land and the climate here are not as good as those in Italy, and most areas do not have convenient conditions for great voyages. Therefore, most areas of Germany are actually relatively poor. Especially in some mountainous areas, the mountain people lack a livelihood. Therefore, many poor people in Germany choose to be extremely dangerous mercenaries as their livelihood. But what are these mercenaries who have their heads tied to their belts pursuing? It's nothing more than career and love, money and beauty. Giving them a beautiful Mao girl is equivalent to completing half of their pursuit. Moreover, there is a shortage of camp prostitutes in Marin's army. Marin has always opposed women in his country falling into prostitution because it will affect social order. However, these brave and passionate mercenaries also have physiological needs, and they are relatively strong. Marin did not allow them to go out to find prostitutes, because there was a risk of contracting syphilis. Syphilis was under control under the suppression of the Pope's decree, but it had not been eradicated. Therefore, Marin did not allow soldiers to go out to find vassal women, but only allowed them to find camp prostitutes. However, the number of camp prostitutes was too small, and Marin was always worried about it. After all, there were tens of thousands of young and strong men in need, but there were only a few dozen camp prostitutes, which was not enough. Purchasing Eastern European female slaves captured by the Crimean Khanate was a good solution. The outstanding female slaves could be used as wives to reward soldiers. Ordinary ones could also be bought in batches to serve as camp prostitutes to meet the needs of soldiers without the risk of syphilis. After all, camp prostitutes were not open to the public, so there was no need to worry about contracting syphilis. Of the tens of thousands of soldiers under Marin's command, more than half are single. Currently, only some soldiers with good economic conditions who have been allocated land due to their military merits have found wives. Most soldiers are still single. Even the more than 10,000 Saxon militiamen captured last time, although they were all returned to East Frisia, and the Saxons also promised to send their families, but there were also thousands of bachelors among them. So, East Frisia is actually very short of women now. After a rough calculation, the current shortage of young women in East Frisia is as high as more than 10,000. This number shocked Marin. Therefore, Marin immediately accepted Kohler's suggestion to buy Eastern European female slaves. Moreover, these Eastern European female slaves were also very cheap. According to the information obtained by Kohler's subordinate art, in Venice, an original Eastern European beauty only cost 30 ducats, an ordinary-looking original girl only cost 20 gold coins, and a woman under 30 years old only cost 10 gold coins. Moreover, this is only the price in Venice. In fact, in the Crimean Khanate slave export port of Kaffa, the price of an original Eastern European beauty is only 15 gold coins, the price of an ordinary original young girl is only 10 gold coins, the price of an ordinary woman under 30 years old, a good-looking one is only 6 gold coins, and a not-so-good-looking one is only 4 gold coins. It is so cheap that it is outrageous. Moreover, it is said that male slaves there are also very cheap. A strong adult man only costs 6 gold coins. Of course, Marin is not short of men now, but women. After all, he has more than 10,000 bachelors, crying for food. So, Marin ordered a ship to be sent to buy 200 good-looking women to replenish the camp prostitutes and calm the restless hearts of the bachelor soldiers. Not only that, Marin actually has his own little evil thoughts in his heart: the more people the Crimeans capture, the greater the impact on the future of Russia. Marin even planned to secretly place a large order, specifically requiring the Crimeans to capture people from the Grand Duchy of Moscow, Russia, as commodities for the transaction. In this way, Marin could not only buy beauties to meet the needs of the soldiers, but also secretly drive the Crimean Khanate, which is still very powerful, to cause trouble for the Russians and hinder their rise. Marin knew the potential of the Russians. If they were allowed to develop and dominate Eastern Europe, they would pose a serious threat to the German region. Therefore, using the benefits in advance to drive the Crimean Khanate's bandits to plunder the Russian population can not only meet their own needs, but also weaken the Russians in disguise through the Crimean Khanate, which can be said to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Therefore, Marin decided to place large orders for the bandits of the Crimean Khanate for a long time, specifically purchasing female slaves, produced in the Grand Duchy of Moscow, and drive the Crimean Khanate to find trouble with the Russians. Even if he had enough, Marin would continue to place orders. At worst, he could give the extra women to his subordinates as mistresses or female slaves. If that didn't work, he could also move to the American colonies for development. You know, Russian women are also very hardworking and are no worse at work. The Russians are robbed of their women every year, which will have a great impact on their fertility and make it difficult for the population to grow. If the population does not grow, the source of soldiers will be limited. If they want to expand, they will be restricted. In addition, Marin's allies, the Teutonic State and Russia, are also hostile to each other. In this way, it can be regarded as helping the allies to weaken the opponents. It can be said that it kills 2 birds with 1 stone. Chapter 324 Granada, Central America, Caribbean Sea. It was September of 1500. After 4 months of sailing, the fleet led by Amerigo finally arrived in Granada. The fleet first arrived at Martinique in the Windward Islands, but after comparing the map given by Marin, Amerigo found that it was not Granada, so he continued to explore southward. Along the way, Amerigo used the sextant and related formulas made by Leonardo da Vinci, as well as a high-precision pocket watch, to constantly calculate longitude and latitude. With these longitude and latitude, the next time he sailed, if he arrived at the nearby sea area, he only needed to calculate the longitude and latitude again and compare them with the original records to easily correct the route. However, although Marin knew the specific distribution of the Windward Islands, he could not remember the specific longitude and latitude. After all, Granada was just a small country in later generations. If the Americans had not invaded Granada, Marin might not have been interested in this small island. Therefore, he gave a rough distribution map of the Windward Islands and asked Amerigo to find and compare them himself, and then write down the relevant longitude and latitude. Marin's instructions were, after reaching the Windward Islands, head south until you reach the South American continent. The island closest to the South American continent is Trinidad, and the small island northeast of Trinidad is Tobago. Then, the island northwest of Tobago that is twice the size of Texel is Grenada. Amerigo did exactly that. After arriving in Martinique, he did not stop, but went straight south and soon arrived at Trinidad. Through the telescope, he confirmed that Trinidad was a large island next to the mainland, and there was indeed a large island to its northeast. Then, without saying anything, he turned northwest and soon discovered Grenada. At the same time, he recorded the longitude and latitude of each island along the way. After arriving at Grenada, Amerigo immediately commanded the fleet to begin surveying the hydrology around Grenada, looking for a suitable place to land. However, when the fleet arrived at the waters near St. George in the southwest of Grenada, Amerigo was surprised to find through the telescope that a battle was taking place on the island. About a dozen or so boats of 20 to 30 tons were anchored near the harbor. A large group of ferocious-looking natives, armed with various weapons, viciously attacked the village on the shore. Moreover, according to observation, Amerigo found that the attackers numbered 300 to 400 strong men, all of whom were strong and fierce. However, there were less than 200 men in the village on the island, and not all of them were strong. It seemed that the village on the shore was about to be breached by the invaders. When ships 2503 and 2504 approached the coast of St. George, the two sides who were fighting fiercely on the shore stopped involuntarily. Seeing the two large ships coming from the sea, both sides were surprised. Both sides were stunned for a while. The leader of the resistance, who was wearing bird feathers on his head, seemed to react first. He jumped and shouted at Amerigo's fleet in an unknown language. His voice was desolate, as if he was asking for help. In fact, this middle-aged man who looked like a chief was already desperate. So, he didn't care who came from the sea. Anyway, they didn't look like accomplices of the enemy. So, he started to shout for help regardless of anything, and even knelt down to pray to the sea. The invaders were stunned, and then looked at the two large ships on the sea with great vigilance. No one knew what was wrong with the leader, but he actually took a fancy to Amerigo's two large ships. In fact, it was the Caribs, who were more warlike in the Caribbean, who invaded Grenada, while the Arawak, who were more peaceful and first lived on the island, were the invaders. The Caribs originally lived on the South American continent, but in the last 100 or 200 years, they began to march towards the islands in the Caribbean region, driving larger canoes and holding spears, and occupied the territories of the local Arawak people. According to Spanish records, the Caribs were quite brutal. Every time they attacked a village, they would kill all the men in the village, even eat them, and take the women as their wives and concubines. There is no consensus on whether the Caribs ate the Arawak men, but it is an indisputable fact that they killed all the Arawak men. Originally, Amerigo had planned to use a telescope to observe the indigenous people's war methods. Unexpectedly, as soon as they approached, the two sides were no longer able to fight. What shocked Amerigo the most was that the attacking native warriors actually began to retreat to large canoes, and then, rowed towards his two large ships. Soon, Amerigo realized that the other party wanted to seize his two ships. Amerigo was furious. "Damn, you dare to fight my gunboats with just a dozen large canoes, you really don't know how to write the word death." So, Amerigo ordered the sailors to raise the flexible and maneuverable triangular sails and began to fight against the indigenous fleet. Ships 2503 and 2504 were equipped with 40 12-pound guns. Because they were survey ships, they did not need to carry cargo, only food and weapons and ammunition. Therefore, the ammunition on board was sufficient. When the indigenous canoe fleet approached, Amerigo immediately ordered the cannon to open fire. At a distance of several hundred meters, the accuracy was not high, but more than a dozen indigenous canoes were close together. Moreover, these canoes were large, probably made of thousand-year-old trees, and the targets were not small. So, in the first round of shelling, a canoe was smashed on the spot. The natives panicked immediately, not because a ship was sunk, but because they had never heard such loud cannon fire, and they thought it was the angry Thor. The native fleet then began to flee, but Amerigo was already irritated by them and was unwilling to let them go, so he ordered a pursuit. How could a canoe then? The artillery fired and all the indigenous invaders were sent into the sea. When Amerigo's fleet returned to the seaside of the village of St. George, they were warmly welcomed by the local natives. Of course, it was no wonder. If Amerigo's fleet had not suddenly appeared, the 200 men of this village would have been killed by the invaders. Although they did not speak the same language, Amerigo still communicated with the locals through gestures. Based on the pronunciation of the locals, Amerigo learned that they called themselves Arawak and were an agricultural tribe. There were originally 3 tribes of Arawak people on the island, but the other 2 tribes had their villages destroyed by previous invaders, who killed all the men and took away all the women. Therefore, this small tribe of Arawak people called Bukas is now very afraid of the enemy's invasion again. The Bukas are an agricultural tribe. People of agricultural civilization have always been more peaceful and do not like war. Therefore, their fighting power is not strong. In order to save their lives, the chieftain of the Bukas, Labri, begged Amerigo's fleet to stay and help them and protect them. For this, they were willing to give 30% of their harvest to Amerigo. Of course Amerigo was happy, because Marin wanted to colonize this island. Wouldn't it be great if he had help from natives who were familiar with the local area? However, he was about to go north to find the legendary Nantucket Island, so he couldn't stay. So he thought about it and decided to stay for a while, help the locals build a simple fortress, and leave a few metal-tipped spears to the Bukas tribe so that they could protect themselves first. At the same time, Amerigo promised that in a few months, he would send people to protect them and teach them more advanced agricultural techniques and a large number of metal farm tools. Although the Bukas were disappointed, they were not completely disappointed. They were still in the Stone Age and were very fond of the metal-tipped spears that Amerigo gave them. In addition, Amerigo also gave them 10 bows and 10 pots of arrows to strengthen them. Although the Indians could make bows and arrows, their craftsmanship was very crude. The bows of the Caribbean natives had bowstrings made of vines, and the bows had no special treatment. The arrows were also not very good, with stone-polished arrowheads and reed shafts, which had very low kinetic energy and almost no armor-piercing ability. Such bows and arrows can only kill at a distance of 30 to 40 meters. Of course, this is referring to the indigenous people in the Caribbean. After all, the indigenous people in the Caribbean are not very civilized and cannot produce powerful weapons. The Aztecs and Incas can produce more sophisticated weapons. The bows and arrows that Amerigo gave to the Bukas were all carefully crafted by European craftsmen and were originally used by sailors for hunting. After all, the amount of gunpowder was limited in this era, and sailors usually used recyclable bows and arrows for hunting. These European bows and arrows had a killing range of at least 100 meters, far exceeding the Caribbean's native bows and arrows, and the arrowheads were all made of metal. In the eyes of the Bukas, they were naturally good things. Using them to resist the Caribbean's attack would definitely cause heavy casualties to the other side. Then, before leaving, Amerigo arranged for the sailors on the ship who knew the craft of masons to command the Bukas to build a simple and solid camp. Unlike the previous Bukas camp, the walls were tattered. Around the newly built camp, the sailors commanded the Bukas to dig trenches and insert sharp wooden stakes to prevent the enemy's attack. Then, several simple arrow towers were erected in the camp. As long as the enemy dared to come, the Bukas could use the arrow towers to shoot the enemy outside the camp. After the stockade was repaired, Amerigo boarded the ship with his men, bid farewell to the reluctant Bukas people, took some local specialties, left Grenada, and headed north to find the legendary Nantucket Island and Martha's Vineyard. Chapter 325, The Emperor falls into a trap in 1500. After the Battle of Lisle County, northern Germany remained very peaceful, while southern Germany remained very lively. The conflict between the Swiss and the Swabian League never stopped, and the emperor, the most powerful member of the Swabian League, had to occupy and digest the Graubünden area of more than 7,000 square kilometers, so he could not spare any effort to help his allies. Therefore, the Swabian League was always suppressed by the Swiss. Over the past year, many nobles of the Swabian League were driven out of their homes by Swiss mercenaries and forced into exile. So they approached the most powerful Emperor Maximilian I and asked him to send troops to help them recover their territory. In fact, Maximilian I originally planned to support Ludovico Sforza, Duke of Milan, to restore his kingdom after stabilizing the Graubünden region. At this time, the French army had arrived in the Kingdom of Naples and was conquering cities in the Kingdom of Naples. Maximilian I had always considered France his number one enemy and had always wanted to limit France's expansion. In comparison, the Swiss issue seemed less important. However, Maximilian I could not ignore the allies who came to him. After all, the nobles of the Swabian League were his strongest supporters in the imperial parliament. Coincidentally, after more than a year of digestion, Maximilian I had completely controlled the Graubünden region and was able to free up his hands. So, after weighing the pros and cons, Maximilian I finally declared war on Switzerland and demanded that the Swiss return all the occupied territories of the Swabian League. However, influenced by Marin, Maximilian I also learned his lesson. He did not declare war directly on the entire Swiss Confederation, but only on the main enemy of the Swabian League, the Canton of Zurich, to avoid provoking other Swiss cantons. But the Canton of Zurich was no fool. They were already strong and had tens of thousands of elite mercenaries. After seeing the emperor join the war, they also recruited allies from the Swiss alliance, such as Argau, to fight against the Swabian League. At this time, the Swabian League had actually been crippled by the mercenaries of the Canton of Zurich. The only army that could confront the Swiss head-on was the emperor's army. As a result, the remnants of the Swabian League headed to Graubünden to join the emperor's army, letting the emperor's army serve as the main force while they served as auxiliary forces. Maximilian I's army was much stronger than in history. Especially after sending a few people to learn how to deploy troops from Marin, at least in terms of discipline, it was much better than before. In fact, the military discipline of Maximilian I's elite troops was no worse than that of the Swiss. Especially Bowen Gardner and Hatter Basque, who had learned a few tricks from Marin, had become the leaders of the two most elite infantry phalanxes under the emperor. The phalanx trained by these two men was well known in the Austrian army for its strict discipline. However, in terms of tactics, it was different from Marin's phalanx. The biggest difference was that these two men were still using Marin's earliest tactics. For example, long-range firepower was achieved by using archers instead of the muskets of the Spanish phalanx that Marin was promoting. However, this is not surprising. After all, when the two of them followed Marin, Marin had not yet started to promote the use of muskets. Therefore, they used Marin's version 1.0 phalanx, and Marin has now upgraded to the version 2.0 Spanish phalanx, but they have not had time to upgrade. After all, the information transmission in this era is backward, and they did not send officers to East Frisia to study like the Spanish, so it is normal that they don't know. In addition, Maximilian I also had to take care of the Duke of Saxony's feelings. After all, Marin had just defeated the Duke of Saxony. Maximilian I had already offended the Duke of Saxony by insisting on recognizing Marin's status, and sending people to learn new phalanx tactics from Marin was definitely rubbing salt into the Duke of Saxony's wounds. After all, Maximilian I still hoped that the Saxon nobles would vote for him in the imperial parliament. The Spaniards and the Teutonic Kingdom were different. They were not on good terms with Saxony, so they did not need to follow the Saxons' lead. Therefore, they dared to send people to Marin to learn from him without worrying about the Saxons' reaction. Speaking of which, the 1.0 version of the phalanx that Bowen Gardner and Hayter Basque learned was actually quite powerful. It was no problem to deal with ordinary phalanxes. However, times are changing. When Marin first developed the 1.0 version of the phalanx, the Swiss were still in their ascendant, not so rich, and few soldiers were equipped with breastplate armor. But now, 6 years later, Swiss mercenaries are getting richer and richer. After all, their appearance fees are usually at least twice or even 3 times that of ordinary mercenaries. Therefore, they have saved a lot of money and can afford expensive breastplates and helmets. Therefore, the first 3 rows of elite Swiss mercenaries now basically wear breastplate armor, and are no longer the poor army with low armor rate. In the face of arrow attacks, the breastplate and helmet provide good protection. Therefore, the phalanx led by Bowen Gardner and Hayter Basque is not very effective against the archers. When Maximilian I sent his army north to fight the Swiss, he suffered a loss. Under the fierce attack of the Swiss, the main force of Maximilian I was repelled. Only the 2 phalanxes of Bowen Gardner and Hayter Basque stubbornly resisted the fierce attack of the Swiss. However, their bows and arrows had very limited lethality to the Swiss phalanx. Moreover, the other phalanxes were forced to retreat, and it was meaningless for them to continue to stand in the front, so they had to retreat with them. Just like that, the first attack of the complacent Maximilian I ended in such a hasty manner. Not only that, the Swiss were actually not happy to see Maximilian I occupy the Graubünden region. Because the Graubünden region has a rugged terrain and is easy to defend but difficult to attack. Maximilian I occupying such a good place would pose a great threat to the Swiss Confederation. Taking advantage of Maximilian I's defeat, the Swiss army began to attack Graubünden. Fortunately, there were steep passes in the north and west of Graubünden that could be used for defense. Otherwise, Maximilian I's army might have been defeated. Although the Swiss attack was stopped, problems arose in the Graubünden region. Previously, under pressure from the emperor, the 3 major forces that originally ruled the Graubünden region, the Alliance of God's House, the Alliance of Grey Clothes and the Alliance of 10 Districts, saw that Maximilian I was defeated and began to make moves. Although they had been disarmed by Maximilian I before, this was the era of cold weapons, and it was still easy to forge spears again. So they organized blacksmiths to secretly forge weapons and secretly reorganized the team. Some teams had already started to attack the emperor's supply troops in the rear and stole a lot of weapons and armor. The emperor's armor was basically produced by the military factory in Innsbruck. The famous Maximilian armor had been developed and mass-produced. However, on the way from Innsbruck in western Austria to the Graubünden front, a lot of it was taken away by the rebels, which made the emperor furious. The emperor's prestige also plummeted due to the defeat. Many nobles who were originally dissatisfied with the emperor also took the opportunity to make trouble and put obstacles in the way of the emperor. They all hoped that the emperor would lose to the Swiss and lose the Graubünden region. Even Louis XII, who was far away in Naples, got involved. When he heard that the emperor had been defeated by the Swiss Zurich coalition, he immediately released 5,000 Swiss mercenaries and asked them to help the Zurich people. Even the commission was paid by the French. Louis XII's request was very simple. He asked these 5,000 people to help the Zurich coalition defeat the emperor and drive Maximilian I out of the Graubünden area. Once Maximilian I was driven out of the Graubünden area, Ludovico Sforza, Duke of Milan, who retreated to the Tellina Valley south of the Mustare Valley, would lose his rear area. At that time, the Swiss who occupied Graubünden could attack from both sides with the French and completely destroy the remaining troops of Ludovico Sforza. Even if they could not destroy them, they could at least trap them to death. Because the current source of supplies for the remaining troops of Ludovico Sforza stationed in the Tellina Valley is mainly sent by Maximilian I from the Graubünden region through the Mustare Valley. In short, the emperor's rash involvement in the Swabian War triggered a series of chain reactions, and the defeat in the war caused many bad consequences. In one sentence, the emperor fell into a trap. Moreover, this time it was the emperor who took the initiative to jump into the trap. But Maximilian I had to jump. After all, if he did not protect the Swabian League and allowed it to be destroyed by the Swiss, he would have no allies in the imperial parliament to speak for him.